Part 1. Let us begin with that which is without our physical life. Walter Pater. Oathsome sight. How from the rosy lips of life and love flashed the beard-grinning skeleton of death. Alfred, Lord Tennyson, Idylls of the King, 1859. Camilla, you, sir, should unmask. Stranger, indeed. Casilda, indeed it's time. We all have laid aside disguise but you. Stranger, I wear no mask. Camilla, terrified, aside to Casilda, no mask? No mask. Robert W. Chambers, fragment from The King in Yellow, N.D., Act 1, Scene 2. What of art? She asked. It is a melody. Oscar Wilde, The Picture of Dorian Gray, 1891. 3 years after the death of Victor Hugo in 1885, the first exhibition of his graphic works was held at the Galerie Georges Petit in Paris. Among the works there assembled were drawings that Hugo had produced during his stay in the Channel Islands, to which he had retreated upon his exile from France in 1851. The nearly 20 years he spent there, first in Jersey and then in Guernsey, proved unusually fertile in an artistic sense, and when he was not absorbed in intense literary work, Hugo devoted himself to the graphic arts. It was during this period that he discovered an artistic technique involving and exploiting an inherent degree of chance or risk. Point 1. He began to generate forms and images by folding paper in half and blotting it with ink, or by stamping it with cutouts or objects dipped in ink. He employed the former method, for example, in Tâche d'encre papier pli et personnages, 1853-55, figure 1, in which he drew out or encouraged the appearance of the faces and grotesques that he saw lurking within the aleatory shapes. Born of the interaction of imagination and technical ingenuity, and involving, as he himself put it, all sorts of queer mixtures that eventually render more or less what I have in my eye and above all in my mind, Hugo's images are projections from within, their curves, dimensions, and contours roughly approximating the features of subconscious phantoms and the internal landscape they haunt. Point 2. Most of the drawings that Hugo produced during this period are dominated by fluid, amorphous masses from which shadowy patterns, forms, and structures surface, hinting at meanings unsettling and often ominous. The French literateur Théophile Gautier referred to them as dark and savage fantasies imbued with the chiaroscuro effect of Goya and the architectural terror of Piranesi. 3. A unique series of dead bells, 1855-56, contain eerie images created when Hugo dipped a piece of finely patterned lace in ink, pressed it between two leaves of paper, and then enhanced the impression with ink blots. The resultant image would depend on how much of the lace had been treated with ink and on how much pressure had been exerted when the lace was pressed onto the paper. The effect is eerie, for the technique reproduces the highly structured nature of the fabric, but also, because the ink pattern is fragmentary, suggests that it is in the process of decomposition. Of this select group of blotesques, 3 in particular merit close scrutiny: a carte de Boos, figure 2, the earliest and best known of the dentelles, and 2 of the dentelles et spectres, frontispiece, and figure 3, so called because in them Hugo conjures up the toothy, grinning skulls that he discovered staring out at him, latent within the filaments of the design. All 3 pieces are linked by the organicism that Hugo perceived and emphasized within the lacy figurations. The carte de Boos, bearing the handwritten date along the bottom of the card 1 Er Janvier 1856 that has allowed scholars to roughly date its companion pieces, is richly evocative. In it, the first letter of Hugo's last name descends from a fretted image that hovers, wraith-like, in the muted upper half of the card, although so much more substantial than the shadowy entity out of which they materialize. The letters HUGO are inextricably tied to an ancestral point of origin, however ephemeral or skeletal it may appear, and thus connect the artist himself, by extension, to the reticulated spectres of his art. The lace of the dentelles et spectres, in particular, seems to evoke the physiological qualities of the human body whose grinning skull it discloses. Hugo emphasized and highlighted the amorphousness latent in the fragile, delicately delineated lines that blur and melt in the midst of their own surcharged intricacy, the signature of the fabric's complexity but also the signifier of its imminent dissolution. Like the human body, which in its healthy state displays a pleasing symmetry but upon its demise reverts to an amorphous chaos, undifferentiated and atomized, lace is characterized by an ornamental design often predicated upon the ordered repetition of symmetrical patternings. It is also, however, an open-work material reminiscent of a skeletal structure from which the flesh has been eaten away, burnt out or etched, to use the argot of the lace makers. The lace of Hugo's dentelles et spectres thus functions as a medium revealing underlying structures that, when fleshed out again with haunting images drawn from Hugo's own reservoir of sublimated horrors, metamorphose into blotted phantoms. The phantoms, turning their gaze upon the viewer, reveal a skeletal rictus with teeth. The French dentelle means little tooth, prominently displayed. Viewed in evolutionary terms, lace might be thought of as the Roderick Usher of its species, easily thrilled by external stimuli. The slightest of breezes disturbs it, too strong a life foxes it, easily torn asunder, its complexity quick with dissolution. Its defining quality, its fragile beauty, also poses the greatest threat to its material integrity. It is worth noting that because Hugo utilized the same wisp of lace for the dozen or so dentelles that he generated, the demise of the fabric signaled the extinction of this particular subspecies of graphic works. Point 4. Working in little, the largest of the dentelles measures 38 by 13 centimeters, whereas the dentelles et spectres are even smaller, measuring only 6.5 by 6 centimeters. Hugo brings to light web networks of association and meaning in which each mesh draws in all the rest, and thus he compels his viewer to confront the skeletal figures that would otherwise lurk undetected within the larger patterns that constitute the fabric as a whole. He resurrects in this body of work his belief, voiced some 20 years earlier, that what we call the ugly is a detail of a great whole which eludes us, and which is in harmony, not with man but with all creation. 5. Moreover, he exploits the innately conflictive nature of his medium. Laces, after all, fretted, containing both ornamental patterns and cankerous spots in which it is simultaneously made and unmade, and renders explicit what is often ignored, the unstable and therefore unnerving character of a fabric prized for its attenuated beauty. In so doing, Hugo recast his medium as the thread to invoke the metaphor he introduces in the preface to Cromwell, 1827, its disquisition upon the grotesque that frequently connects what we, following our special whim, call defects with what we call beauty, a condition synonymous, in Hugo's view, with originality and genius. Defects, at all events those which we call by that name, are often the inborn, necessary, inevitable conditions of good qualities. Sit genius, nat hollycombs qui tempera adestro. Whoever saw a metal without its reverse? A talent that had not some shadow with its brilliancy, some smoke with its flame. Such a blemish can be only the inseparable consequence of such beauty. Point 6. The lace, suggesting the connection between Hugo's own genius and his troubled unconscious, also functions as a medium in another sense of the word, for it becomes a channel through which an ominous thing intrudes upon the viewer's field of vision. When we examine lace closely, our eyes stumble across an uneven terrain where accretion leads onto black holes of emptiness defined by the edges of grotesques and arabesques. A multitude of tiny abysses mushrooms in the midst of a complex design. M.R. James gave us a way to visualize this very phenomenon in Mr. Humphreys and His Inheritance, 1911, in which, poring over a sheet of paper bearing his original plan for a maze, the eponymous character stumbles across a hitch that he had not noticed before, an ugly black spot about the size of a shilling. As he stares into the hole, but how should the hole be there, he wonders he is unexpectedly overwhelmed by feelings of hate, then of anxiety, then of horror at the notion that something might emerge from it and rise to the surface. And, of course, something does emerge. Nearer and nearer it came, and it was of a blackish gray color with more than one dark hole. It took shape as a face, a human face, a burnt human face, and with the odious writhings of a wasp creeping out of a rotten apple there clambered forth an appearance of a form, waving black arms prepared to clasp a head that was bending over them. 7. Hugo's plotesques in general and his dead-hells in particular are similarly transgressive, like the hole in Mr. Humphreys' plan, which, as we discover, runs down through paper, table, and floor into the infinite depths of the abyss, defined by the violation of demarcating borders, those, for example, that separate complexity of design and amorphousness, ornament, and decomposition, and, finally, the visible and invisible worlds. The reality that they disclose is deeply imbued with the sadness that William James, in the Varieties of Religious Experience, 1902, detected at the heart of every merely positivistic, agnostic, or naturalistic scheme of philosophy. Let sanguine healthy-mindedness, he wrote, do its best with its strange power of living in the moment and ignoring and forgetting, still the evil background is really there to be thought of, and the skull will grin in at the banquet, back of everything is the great spectre of universal death. It is precisely the evil background ignored by the sanguine, healthy-minded that becomes the point d'appuie for Hugo's dead hells, which depict the moment at which the mask begins to slip, revealing the power of the unconscious, just as M.R. James's story reveals the power of the living past, and a vital source of his creative impulse. What is made suddenly manifest in the dead hells is not the unconquerable soul that seems, for the protagonist of William Ernest Henley's vigorously optimistic Invitus, 1888, to be a talisman against the looming horror of the shade, but the grinning bare skeletal truth of things, the always denied triumph of the horrific, the rictus Invitus. Because the sheer number of drawings displayed there suggested that Hugo's acuity was as compellingly visual as it was literary, the 1888 exhibition at the Galerie Georges Petit proved enormously important to students of Hugo's work, prompting a revolution of what the Belgian symbolist Emile Verhaeren called l'imagination Hugoine. The exhibition also served as a confirmation of a belief that many of those in attendance had long maintained, that Hugo, poet saker, the phrase belongs to Auguste Vacquerie, Hugo's friend and spokesperson, and dessinator de génie, the designation of the painter Benjamin Constant, was quite simply le maître. Stéphane Mallarmé made that role explicit in a letter in which he invited the Provençal poet Theodore Banel to reside as his guest in a room that he had carefully decorated with an old lace thrown over the bed, and simply, together with the portrait of Hugo, the portraits of friends who deserve to be here. 10. The exhibition also revealed that in the dead hells Hugo had discovered an idiom that rendered the pieces assembled there consonant with two distinct cultural moments, that in which they had been engendered and that in which they were finally disclosed to the gaze of the public. When he identified the strange originality and unlooked for effect of Hugo's drawings, which had been born of the transformation of the blot of ink and which revealed images striking, mysterious, sometimes sublime, sometimes familiar, always wonderful, Gautier spoke for viewers such as Edmond de Goncourt, who took particular note of the exposition in his journal, and Joris Karl Huysmans, who wrote in praise of these painted tempests considerably quieter, however, than the hurricane of his sentences. That assail one with an obsessive fear. 11. All of these aesthetes shared a way of looking at things that was predicated on the notion that the outward and the sensible always bodied forth, however imperfectly, the inward and the ineffable. A dream of form in days of thought was how Oscar Wilde expressed this dialectic in The Picture of Dorian Gray, 1891.12. Perhaps because he was so fervent an admirer of Hugo's work, Gautier went to the heart of the master's otherworldly visions when he alluded to the curious shape that they assumed. Behind the reality he introduces the fantastic like a shadow behind the body, and one never forgets that in this world every figure, beautiful or deformed, is followed by a black spectre like a shadowed page 13. It was a glimpse of the same crepuscular reality that Nathaniel Hawthorne, a contemporary of Hugo who was similarly intrigued by the notion of an intermediate world of shadows in which things otherwise unseen might be made partially manifest, had hoped to afford his reader when, in a notebook entry of August 14, 1835, he recorded the germ of a grim, weird story wherein the figure of a gay, handsome youth, or young lady might all at once, in a natural, unconcerned way, take off its face like a mask, and show the grinning bare skeletal face beneath. 14. In Tess of the D'Urbervilles, 1891, Thomas Hardy presents his reader with the heroine who, moments before she disfigures the beautiful face that has brought her such woe, presses her hand to her brow, and feels its curve, and the edges of her eye sockets perceptible under the soft skin, and, with the prescience symptomatic of what her husband terms the ache of modernism, thinks with longing of the time when that bone would be bare and when her corporeal frame would thus more truly cohere with her blighted condition. 15. The jungle that looks like a mask heavy like the closed door of a prison, with its air of hidden knowledge, of patient expectation, of unapproachable silence, whispers to Conrad's curds of things of which he had no conception, but which he approximates by means of a series of heads on stakes, all the faces but one turned in toward his house, and then one, correspondent, presumably, with the rest, black, dried, sunken, with closed eyelids and with the shrunken dry lips showing a narrow white line of teeth, smiling continuously. 16. Similarly populated with apparently robust individuals who nevertheless turn upon the viewer a death's head stare, the imaginary worlds of the symbolist artist James Ensor, Felician Rops, and, in his late sick phase, the Viennese artist Anton Romaco remind us that Hugo and Hawthorne, as well as their late 19th century heirs presumptive, were not merely appropriating the image of the skeleton at the feast from a memento mori tradition that dates back to antiquity, but taking inspiration from an evolving scientific discourse that increasingly recast the physical world itself as a Melvillian pasteboard mask. Rops's coquettes romp at masked balls, seducing with fleshless grins, figure 4, while the subject of Romaco's portrait of Isabella Reiser, 1885, figure 5, although nominally alive, maintains a cadaverous presence, her strange beauty erotically engaged with the spectre figured forth in eyes that stare without speculation, in teeth prominently outlined and curiously fetishized, in the heart. Angularity of a waist cinch to achieve the waisted proportions of the dead, and in wrists decoratively manacled with coiled snakes. End source is the only speculative sphere in this end source surrounded by masks. 1899, figure 6, which depicts a world overrun with figures whose masquerade of life reveals more than it conceals about the parade of death in which they are taking part. This death in life theme defines end source corpus, and nowhere does it figure more vividly than in 3 self-portraits: Death's Head, 1886, Skeleton Painter, 1896, and My Portrait Skeletonized, 1889, figure 7, 9, and 11a and 11b. Because 2 of these self-portraits, Skeleton Painter and My Portrait Skeletonized, were preceded by photographs, figures 8 and 10, in which the artist stands in for the relic figure, it has been suggested that, in replacing his own head with a skull, Ensor is anticipating a future 17. Such a reading, however, treats Ensor's work as a mere redaction of the traditional skeleton at the feast, in which a corpse image, artfully devised in wood or silver, and sometimes articulated, served both as an emblem of the inexorable approach of death and as a spur to good living, reminding the celebrants among whom it was circulated that what this is, we soon shall be, / then be merry whilst you may. 18. However sobering, or, conversely, stimulating, the revelers find the truth that is conveyed by the relic referred to in Petronius Arbiter Satyricon, in which the original version of these lines appears. There is nothing deceptive or counterfeit about the memento of a future condition. The photographs, on the other hand, emphasize what Ensor's self-portraits were intended to make clear even had there been no such accompaniments, that it is in the present that the artist is thus anatomized. The horror of the self-portraits resides not merely in what is represented in undead but ever-dying character but in the presentation of the representation, for this is a composition depicting the artist's own ongoing decomposition. It rests, in other words, in the unveiling of what Simons, in his exposition of the decadent style of literature, had identified as la verite vraie, the very essence of truth of appearances to the senses, of the visible world to the eyes that see it, and the truth of spiritual things to the spiritual vision. 19. The decadents in whose behalf he spoke anticipated in their writings the possibility that the two truths that made up the whole might be inversely related, that the visible symbol might serve as the inverted representation of the invisible ideal that it prefigures. They acquired their idiom within a changing intellectual landscape mapped out not merely by their romantic precursors by the Hugos and the Hawthornes but also by those whose occupation it was to read and decipher surface configurations, geological formations, bodily types, word patterns, and were therefore increasingly drawn to conclusions as startling as that which Charles Darwin had reached when he realized with wonder that the peaceful woods and smiling fields that presented themselves to his view served but to camouflage the dreadful but quiet war of organic beings engaged in a contest. And a grain of sand turns the balance. 20. This a March 1839 notebook entry that might be mistaken for the rough sketch of a horror story was penned less than a year after he had reminded himself, again in his notebook, that when we talk of higher orders, we should always say, intellectually higher, for who with the face of the earth covered with the most beautiful savannas and forests dare to say that intellectuality is the only aim in this world. 21. The revelation of hidden and previously unanticipated realities, the cryptic slow force cracking surface, for example, to which he referred in an entry dating from 1838 struck him as being truly poetical. 22. In 1838 Darwin could cite as a reference and tentative point of departure Wordsworth's belief that poetic expression would provide a way to read the countenance of all science, with science itself assuming a form of flesh and blood, transmogrified into a being whom the poet, lending his divine spirit to aid in the transfiguration, would then welcome as a dear and genuine inmate of the household of man. 23. Less than a year later, although he had not altogether abandoned his anthropocentric metaphor, Darwin had begun to see more plainly the full implications of the evolutionary insights that would serve as the basis for his life's work that cost him dearly in psychic terms, because he knew that his revelations would surely hasten the erosion of some of his culture's most cherished beliefs and expose him as well to the charge of being fully gripped by what John Ruskin vilified as the universal instinct of blasphemy in the modern vulgar scientific mind, an instinct above all manifested in its love of what is ugly, and natural enthrallment by the abominable. If only the geologists would let me alone, he would gripe in a letter to his friend Henry Ackland, I could do very well, but those dreadful hammers. I hear the clink of them at the end of every cadence of the Bible verses. 24. Less than a year later, Darwin was more inclined to share the view that Ruskin had expressed metaphorically when he deplored humanity's having been hitherto taught, not by portraits of great men, but by the skulls of cretins housed in the Natural History Museum of Oxford, the same view that Hugo had rendered graphically in his El Hombre du Mantenelier, c. 1854, figure 12, in which the artist visualizes an otherwise inviting manchineel tree whose branches looking as though they offer nothing more threatening than a protective shield from a blinding noonday sun harbor more shade than shadow in their leafy depths. 25. Nature, monstrous nature, still seemed to possess the smiling face of a beckoning fair one, but the mask had begun to slip. In speaking of the material revolution that the labors of men of science promised, or threatened, to instigate, and of the consequent need of the poet to reinvest a world made manifestly and palpably material with sensation, Wordsworth anticipated the continued rise of scientific materialism, although even his poetic insight could not have forewarned him that 19th century scientific discovery and discourse would eventually dispense altogether with the poet's intuitive services, adopting instead a rationalistic and positivistic system predicated on the belief that exterior forms serve as indices of incontinence to interior, and hitherto occult, processes, agents, and states of being. 26. A point of view that had begun to coalesce much earlier had become dominant by the century's close, when the German philologist F. Max Muller prefaced the 1890 edition of The Science of Language, which had made its first appearance as a series of lectures delivered at the Royal Institution in 1861 and 1863, by asking whether any of his readers could still doubt what an earlier generation had by no means accepted as a matter of course, that the principle of geology that he applies to the science of language hinges on the notion that we must begin with what is known and then proceed to what is unknown. 27. Within such a program, the scientist seemed an adventurer sleuth metaphysician, a role that the physicist John Tyndall made explicit when he described his attempts to show the tendency displayed throughout history, by the most profound investigators, to pass from the world of the senses to a world where vision becomes spiritual. The scientist's quest for knowledge assumed epic proportions, because it subsumed that of the explorer who emerges with conceptions and conclusions, to be approved or rejected according as they coincide, or refuse to coincide, with sensible things and carried with it dangers just as nightmarish as those that beset the heroes of legend. 28. Although it began by reading surface truths, then, 19th century scientific discovery ended by probing hitherto unsuspected depths in both the physical universe and the human psyche, those caverns that had formerly seemed measureless to man. With nature as the scientist's guide, the quest led, as Huxley had prophesied that it might, not to the heights but to the edge of a country as mysterious as Africa seemed to the first European explorers, with the scientist/explorer himself suffering some diminution in stature in consequence of having to follow humbly as a little child wherever and to whatever abysses nature leads. 29 The material world stood now revealed in all its tenuity as a merely parleying corporeality, and nature itself seemed imbued with the deep cunning which hides itself under the appearance of openness, so that simple people, as George Eliot knew, think they can see through her quite well, and all the while she is secretly preparing a refutation of their confident prophecies. 30 The extremity of distaste suffered by those whose sensibilities were affronted by the sight, or impression, at least, of nature all indecorously unveiled is notoriously registered in Ruskin's response, composed on January 13, 1886, and published 6 days later in the Pall Mall Gazette, to the list of the best 100 books that Sir John Lubbock had put forward in a lecture at the Working Men's College. My dear Sir, Ruskin begins, putting my pen lightly through the needless and blottlessly through the rubbish and poison of Sir John's list I leave enough for a life's liberal reading. 31 The rubbish and poison included Darwin's Origin of Species, effaced because it is every man's duty to know what he is, and not to think of the embryo he was, nor the skeleton that he shall be. Because, also, Darwin has a mortal fascination for all vainly curious and idly speculative persons, and has collected, in the train of him, every impudent imbecility in Europe, like a dim comet wagging its useless tail of phosphorescent nothing across the steadfast stars. 32 The Darwinian theory born of this fascination, continues Ruskin, is mischievous in the avidity with which it licenses its immodestly roving speculations to go before, behind, above, below the body of nature, not only in looking to the past term instead of the present creature but looking also in the creature itself to the growth of the flesh instead of the breath of the spirit. The loss of mere happiness, in such modes of thought, is incalculable. When I see a girl dance, I thank heaven that made her cheerful as well as graceful, and envy neither the signs nor sentiment of my Darwinian friend, who sees in her only a cross between a dodo and a daddy long legs. 33. Ruskin might have been less harsh had he known that the subject of his imprecations and, more generally, those whose training had enabled them to anticipate or accept the surprises that came with the new scientific discoveries was not himself immune to the sort of intense anxiety that often gripped the best and most cultivated minds of the day, some of whom, according to the Hungarian journalist Max Nordau, came to view science as having deceived them because it had not done for them what it had promised to do. 34 Darwin found disheartening the startling implications of the discoveries of the physicist whose speculations had prompted him to entertain a pet horror in which he conceived of a Welsh future as the progress of millions of years, with every continent swarming with good and enlightened men, all ending in this the heat death of the world, and with probably no fresh start until this our planetary system has been again converted into red hot gas. Sic transit gloria mundi, with a vengeance. 35 And he was troubled by the implications of his own investigations, was disconcerted, for example, even by the illusory quiet he encountered in the present, in the typical English landscape, compact of ephemerality and desperate struggle. The previously mentioned passage from one of Darwin's early notebooks merits comment not least because it conjoins the beauty of a picturesque landscape of peaceful woods and smiling fields with shocking realities and an anxiety deriving from the knowledge that an underlying struggle, a dreadful but quiet war, may be embodied in an apparently pastoral image. The same unceasing struggle for existence was apparent to Huxley in the flowing contours of the downs that made up the whole countryside visible from the windows of the room in which he wrote the Prolegomena. 36 Huxley's Downs, like Darwin's patch of woodland or Matthew Arnold's memorable stretch of Dover Beach or Hardy's Vale of Blakemore, or Blackmoor aforesaid, known in former times as the Forest of White Hart, with traces of its earlier condition to be found in the old oak copses and irregular belts of timber that yet survive upon its slopes, reveal a world in which fixity proves illusory and stability chimerical. 37 Turn back a square foot of the thin turf, Huxley urged. The solid foundation of the land, exposed in cliffs of chalk 500 feet high on the adjacent shore, yields full assurance of a time when the sea covered the side of the everlasting hills, and when the vegetation of what land lay nearest was as different from the present flora of the Sussex Downs as that of Central Africa now is. 38 Huxley speaks not merely of impermanence and disequilibrium, but of a landscape counterfeited. Although it had once been plausible to assume that truth was beauty and beauty truth, the new sciences revealed that even all that seemed benign or beautiful merely masked was in reality symptomatic or premonitory of extensive processes of decay, so that rioting nature itself became in fact a vast memento mori, a continual reminder of the forces in nature that were degenerative and decompositive. 39. And if, as Huxley speculated in the Prolegomena, man, physical, intellectual, and moral, is as much a part of nature as the humblest weed, then the human body too seemed destined to bear the figurations of the cosmic process of which it was a product. 40 The grammar of those engaged in the ongoing discussion of devolution and degeneration regularly trode the body as a text scripted with ciphers that stood for the reversionary tendencies lying dormant within the natural world, the silent laws, as Cesare Lamrasso viewed them, which never cease to operate and which rule society with more authority than the laws inscribed on our statute books. 41 Recapitulation, a variety of degeneration theory, in particular focused typically on the body of the born criminal, its contours determined, it was thought, by an ancestral past that found fresh expression in the physiognomical, phrenological, and, by extension, behavioral traits of its hapless heirs. The French psychiatrist Jean Esquirol described that primitive past as a fatal heritage painted upon the physiognomy, on the external form, on the ideas, the passions, the habits, the inclinations of those who are the victims of it, whereas Havelock Ellis spoke of the criminal physiognomy as having been branded by the hand of nature. 42 In his influential trait, The Degenerescences Physiques, Intellectuels et Moralis de Ellis Domain, 1857, the French psychologist Benedict and Augustin Morel referred to the typical stamp and typical impress of degenerations, which impelled the scientist to confide to the engraver the care of giving a very exact idea of the different types of degenerated beings. 43 In the notorious 1895 study of degeneration upon which his fame chiefly rested, Nordau characterized the deformities by which degeneracy betrays itself as stigmata and brand marks, although he considered these to be unfortunate terms derived from a false idea, as if degeneracy were necessarily the consequence of a fault, and the indication of it a punishment. 16 to 17.44. The physiognomist thus becomes the privileged reader of the body/text of the criminal, who was thought to be incapable of realizing the significance and signification of his or her own body, and equally unaware of the fact that the criminal acts that he or she was impelled to commit were themselves prefigured. Therein. 45 The bearer of the anatomized word required a reader, someone to take in the impression conveyed by the body thus stigmatized, thus textualized, in order that that body might be identified, controlled, disciplined, and perhaps punished. Moreover, he or she required a knowing reader capable of interpreting what the French neurologist Guillaume du Château described in his Mécanisme de la physionomie humaine, 1862, as ce language de la physionomie le language universal et immutable, this language of facial expression, the universal and immutable language, and not merely the ordinary observer receptive only to what Ellis identified as the expression or mimic, a countenance sad or merry, angry or good, tempered, cowed or elate, just as the legal and scientific apparatus required a reliable lexicon upon which to base their interpretations. 46.1 Who understood, as the American phrenologist and editor of the American Phrenological Journal and Miscellany Orson S. Fowler did, that shape is as structure, and structure as character, and therefore shape as character would also be prepared to decipher by universal observation hieroglyphic bodily inscriptions, the shape of the jaws, or the cut of the ears, or the lines of the forehead were among those that Ellis identified. 47 Like the paleontologist who studied fossil remains, or the geologist who surveyed topographical patternings, or the philologist who traced word morphologies, the criminal anthropologist recognized what Nancy Steppen terms the law of physique as a reflection of a biological imperative that was the only law that the degenerate could not help but obey and the only law by which he could be judged. 48 In the sense 19th century recapitulation functioned as a semiotic science that studied external differences and surface drapery in order to discern the underlying constituent form, the true figure, what the naturalist Comte de Buffon saw as the internal differences where the meanings were. 49 To writers such as Lamrasso and Nordau, however, the success of such scientific attempts to detect degeneracy was threatened by the fact that some forms of retrogression did not seem to betray themselves outwardly. 50 What was the reader to do in those cases in which reversionary tendencies disguised themselves or failed in some other fashion to announce themselves extrinsically? Such, according to Lamrasso, were the facts in the case of the rare individual whose pleasing aspect merely masked an underlying psychosis and a spiritual deformity, just as Darwin's smiling fields belied the dreadful but quiet war raging beneath the surface. 51 This threat to the semiotics of physiognomy was the man of genius, whose appearance, Lamrasso believed, was a sign that a culture has reached its peak and begun to decline, following one of the reactionary curves that, as he later argued in Atavism and Evolution, 1895, the most advanced peoples must inevitably describe. 52 Granting that not every genius was insane, Lamrasso nevertheless accepted as not devoid of solid foundation the conclusions put forward by his contemporaries who branded genius itself as always a neurosis, and often a true insanity. 53 Genius, he insisted, was by its very nature excessive, a teratological distortion of normal cerebration, as pathological in its own way as common criminality or brute savagery, and as consequential, just as giants pay a heavy ransom for their stature in sterility and relative muscular and mental weakness, so the giants of thought expiate their intellectual force in degeneration and psychoses. 6. The point of greatest strain and achievement lying naturally near to the danger line of accident and disaster, genius was increasingly represented as a fragile, unsustainable state of evolutionary decadence, as a high-revolved complexity continually evanescing into confusion, madness, and bizarrerie. 54 In 1891 a conceit that had already become something of a philosophical commonplace found perhaps its most vivid expression in Herman Melville's Billy Budd, Sailor, in which the surgeon, considering the display of a transient excitement and unwanted agitation so at variance with Captain Vere's normal manner, wonders who in the rainbow can draw the line where the violet tint ends and the orange tint begins. Distinctly we see the difference of the colors, but where exactly does the one first blendingly enter into the other? So with sanity and insanity. In pronounced cases there is no question about them. But in some supposed cases, in various degrees supposedly less pronounced, to draw the exact line of demarcation few will undertake, though for a fee becoming considerate some professional experts will. The American physician John F. Nisbet, writing nearly a decade after Melville's meditation on the confluence of madness and divinest sense, put the matter more prosaically when he spoke of sanity as frequently merging into insanity, and insanity into genius, but both men had been anticipated by Darwin when, in a somewhat cryptic notebook entry of June 1838, he wondered whether the doctrine of monsters was not preeminently worthy of study on the idea of those parts being most easily most revived sick, which last produced insane man. In civilized countries. 55 In the sense insanity acquired a certain cachet, because a simple organism with less differentiation of tissue and less complexity of structure, a savage or a child, as Henry Maudsley suggested, could aspire only to imbecility, or idiocy, although he conceded that accompanying the ganglionic and neural complexity characteristic of the mental organization of the cultured individual was a correlative degeneration and increase of insanity, the penalty which an increase of our present civilization necessarily pays. 56 Genius represented the quintessentially devolutionary state, not only because a sufficiently advanced civilization alone could aspire to this plateau of derangement, but also because, there being infinite varieties shading insensibly one into another, the extremest cases of madness had their origin in the highest level of mental soundness. 57 And all this, of course, was in the service of orthodoxy, conservatism, and conformity. Congruencies might exist between outward form and the inward condition it clothed, deformation translating deformation, as in the case of the subversive Arthur Schopenhauer, whose countenance was, according to Lamrasso, inscripted with the various characters of degeneration: large ears, very prominent eyes, thick lips, a short, upturned nose. 148 Lombrosso's disciple discovered in astonishing completeness all the physical and mental marks of degeneration gathered together in the features of the symbolist poet Paul Verlaine, who, with his wholly bald and huge long skull, misshapen by enigmatic bumps, seemed to Nordau to answer exactly, trait for trait, to the descriptions of the degenerate given by the clinicists. 119 He was apparently not alone in his opinion, which, according to Ellis, was shared by those for whom Verlaine's very remarkable head with its projecting orbital arches and acrocephalic occiput, called by some satanic accounts the monstrous alliance of the most eminent faculty of man, genius, with the most pronounced tendencies to crime. 58 Arthur Conan Doyle's characterization of the criminal genius Professor Moriarty, Sherlock Holmes's nemesis, who, with his clean-shaven, pale, and ascetic-looking countenance, retains something of the professor in his features, makes clear that not only anthropologists but writers of popular fiction as well had acquired the criminological idiom by the century's close. Professor Moriarty's degeneracy, the consequence of hereditary tendencies of the most diabolical kind, and the criminal strain that ran in his blood, which, instead of being modified, was increased and rendered infinitely more dangerous by his extraordinary mental powers, is betrayed by the forehead that domes out in a white curve and by the face that protrudes forward and is forever slowly oscillating from side to side in a curiously reptilian fashion. 59 In his Chronicles of the House of Borgia, 1901, Frederick Rolfe also strikes the anthropologist's stance when he cites the case of the mathoid Savonarola who bore the vestiges of his own conflicted nature, in the mold of the animal man. He had the long head with immense hinder development, the great thick nose, the enormous lower lip, coarse mouth, heavy jowl, upper rim as well as the little lateral muscles of the nose root, a sign which is unmistakable, although his narrow temples with their overhanging brows, pointed in the middle, struck the note of ideality. 60. It was not always sufficient, however, merely to measure the cranium of an author, or to see the lobe of a painter's ear in order to detect degeneracy, nor 17. Sometimes, as has been suggested, the mind of a giant of thought resided in an ordinary-looking body, and the absence of telltale signs threatened the viability of the whole interpretive apparatus. Given that literary madness, one of the teratologic forms of the human mind, was not only, in Lombroso's view, a curious psychiatric singularity, but a special form of insanity, which hides impulses the more dangerous, because not easy to perceive. 6, 11, 1. And so, by necessity, they went a step further. Lombroso announced that the revelatory physical signs of degeneration might very well be masked by the vivacity of the countenance and the prestige of reputation. 6. Of such notorious individuals as Gautier, Huysmans, and Wilde, each of whom Nordau viewed as a morbid deviation from the original type, a repulsive lusus naturae. 16, 24, despite the fact that they were not visibly deformed. The asymmetry of face and cranium of the born criminal might be readily apparent, but the physiognomy of mental disease would appear very striking and highly diagnostic only to an experienced eye. The phrasing is Morel's, which could detect the abnormal mental stigmata of what Nordau later enumerated as the atrophied sense of morality, the unbounded egoism, impulsiveness, emotionalism, excitability, pessimism, and contempt for the world and man characteristic of the higher degenerate. Nordau 18. 20, 23.61. And just as regressive impulses were anatomized in the born criminal, so psychical atavisms were understood to be literalized in the expressions of what Nordau termed written and painted delirium. 559. The symbolism, special words, assonances, alliteration, aphorisms, and the biblical style which he identified as symptomatic of such psychical aberrations as apathy, originality, eccentricity, and morbid vanity, all characteristic of the man of genius. The German philologist August Schleicher had already argued that any classification predicated on morphological structure alone was bound to be inadequate. Language, a finer, higher criteria, exclusively proper to man, served to distinguish not only humans from animals but also superior human races from inferior ones. For us then, he insisted, the externally observable form of the cranial, facial, and bodily skeleton is markedly less important for the human than that no less material, though infinitely finer, bodily characteristic, of which the symptom is language. The whole higher activity of human life is inseparable from language, and it is for language above all that humanity merits attention. 62. Muller went even further, asserting that the science of language should serve as the basis for a science of human psychology, because the word being the thought incarnate, language itself becomes the primeval and never-ending autobiography of our race. Not till we understand the real nature of language, he announced, shall we understand the real nature of the human self. 63. Because language was the differentia specifica of humanity, specially, and of the individual, psychologically, it could serve as what Lombroso called the principal trace of the delusions of great minds, delusions discernible in the very construction of their works and speeches, in their illogical deductions, absurd contradictions, and grotesque and inhuman fantasies. 322. Nordau saw the Parnassian idiom, for example, with its emphasis upon the intrinsic value of beauty in the sound of words, the sensuous pleasure to be derived from sonorous syllables, as originating in a kind of disorder and permanent chaos that already exists in the brain of the poet, and thus the exaggeration of the importance of rhyme is only a consequence of this state of mind. 270. He identified individual dialects as well, speculating that Maurice Maeterlinck's idiotic sequences of words demonstrated the workings of his shattered brain. That Emile Zola's endless descriptions delineated nothing but his own mental condition, and that from the first to the last page. Friedrich Nietzsche's writings pictured forth for the careful reader a madman, with flashing eyes, wild gestures, and foaming mouth, spouting forth deafening bombast. 227, 495, 416. Wagner's graphomania, he insisted, was traceable in the whole half pages printed in space letters. 182, an incontrovertible sign of his psychosis, and a fortuitous one given that the commonest variety of graphomaniac, according to Lombroso, has true negative characteristics, that is to say, the features and cranial form are nearly always normal. 209. Although he was the great popularizer of these methods of diagnosis, Nordau was not alone in adopting them. As early as 1827, Sir Walter Scott had discerned a connection between the grotesque in the compositions of E.T.A. Hoffmann, reminiscent, he thought, of the arabesque in painting, and an imagination strained to the pitch of oddity and bizarrerie and nerve strained to a morbid degree of acuteness. Thus was the inventor, or at least first distinguished artist who exhibited the fantastic or supernatural grotesque in his compositions, so nearly on the verge of actual insanity that the critic of his oeuvre cannot help considering his case as one requiring the assistance of medicine rather than of criticism. 64. In a review that appeared in the July 1853 issue of the New Monthly magazine. Similarly, the English novelist and critic William Harrison Ainsworth decried Moby Dick as stylistically maniacal, mad as a March hare, mowing, gibbering, screaming, like an incurable bedlamite, reckless of keeper or strait waistcoat. 65. The capriccios and lavish prodigalities characteristic of Horace Walpole's literary luxuries were symptomatic, in Thomas Babington Macaulay's estimation, of an unhealthy and disorganized mind, its whims and affectations covered by mask within mask of conventional behavior, whereas as late as 1930 Simons was ascribing pathogenic qualities to the stylistic excrescences he found in his own works and in those of his contemporaries in his Confessions, a study in pathology, for example. Associating the otherwise wonderful prose of Gerard de Nerval, who numbered one of that group of literary malcontents which most frequently provided Nordau with grist for his inquisitorial mill, with the madman's vision. 66. Less diagnostic than these, perhaps, and less castigatory as well, is Pater, who cast style as a mold bearing the contours of the individual mind to which it belonged. In this way, according to the well-known saying, the style is the man, complex or simple, in his individuality, his plenary sense of what he really has to say, his sense of the world. Style in all its varieties, reserved or opulent, terse, abundant, musical, stimulant, academic, so long as each is really characteristic or expressive, finds thus its justification, the sumptuous good taste of Cicero being as truly the man himself, and not another, justified, yet insured inalienably to him, thereby, as would have been his portrait by Raphael, in full consular splendor, on his ivory chair. 67. Even when effaced anatomically, then even when there was no sign of the expected monstrous alliance of bodily form and inward deformity, genius might well betray itself in literary texts that themselves became what Lombroso termed monuments of phrenopathic poetry. 320. Pater saw in the matter of the imaginative or artistic literature of his day a transcript, not of mere fact but of soul fact, limned in a style expressive of some pre-existent adaptation, between a relative, somewhere in the world of thought, and its correlative, somewhere in the world of language, both alike, rather, somewhere in the mind of the artist, desiderative, expectant, inventive, meeting each other with the readiness of soul and body reunited. 68. To fix the essential nature of the conjunction between language and thought, then, was to fix the personality or pathology of the individual in whose imaginative alembic thought and word had originally coalesced. Individual works of art and literature could thus be treated as narratives of disease in which soul and body reunited by means of a physiological language, Lombroso 217, that expressed the deviance of its maker much as Hugo's attenuated lace incorporated delights and horrors and as an atavistic past lived on in the body of the born criminal. 69. Increasingly for both the anthropologist and the aesthetician, the act of analyzing a literary text became also a diagnosis of the mental condition and sensibility out of which it had emerged. 70. Armed with the torch of Lombroso's method and with the certain knowledge that degenerates are often authors and artists who satisfy with pen and pencil the unhealthy impulses that others satisfied with the knife of the assassin or the bomb of the dynamiter, Nordau, apparently innocent of ironic intent, undertook into generation 1895 the creation of a really scientific criticism of the vast and important domain of art and literature that Lombroso and his disciples had left unexplored. Dedication. As Lombroso had sought to predict future crimes on the evidence of present anomalies, Mancinism or the downy face or the receding forehead, so Nordau attempted to associate aesthetic excesses with artistic aptitude, positing, for example, that because their predominant attribute was the color sense, painters would be decorative, whereas poets would be rich in rhyme, brilliant in style, but barren of thought. Sometimes, he added, they will be decadents. 24.71. In fact, he might have noted that they would almost always be decadents, for he found in the tendencies of contemporary art and poetry a fin de siècle disposition born of the confluence of two well-defined conditions of disease, viz. Degeneration, degeneracy, and hysteria, and he tended to see the dominant literary movements of his day, naturalism, neo-mysticism, and impressionism, for example, as so many expressions of the twilight mood, the decadence of the civilized world. 1543. Complexities of style were often perceived as being symptomatic of the complexities of the cultural moment, and thus the critic Walter Ch1 found it singularly characteristic of this age that the poems which rise to the surface should be examples of ornate art, and grotesque art, not of pure art. 72. The French critic Paul Barguet might wonder at the Kraken-like emergence of decadence, which he referred to as this delicate monster that has never more energetically yawned its distress than in the literature of our century, in which so many conditions of life are perfectioned, all the while fully comprehending that this very perfecting, in complicating our souls as well, makes us inept for happiness. 73. Lacking Barguet's ingenuousness, Nietzsche readily comprehended that the more energetically and boldly a society advances, the richer it will be in failures and deformities, the closer to decline and exhaustion. 74. Just as only a civilization sufficiently evolved could aspire to the insanity of genius, the one, as Maudsley had postulated, blending by nearly imperceptible degrees into the other, so only such a civilization could discover the literary and artistic decadence that was the aesthetic correlative of genius, excessive, transgressive, without restraint, the last pronouncement of the word, as Gautier saw it, summoned to express everything and then pushed to its extreme. And extreme, it should be noted, that Nordau viewed as capable of catapulting the human mind back to its brute beginnings. 485.75. By its very nature, the decadent artist functioned as the transmitter of the most virulent form of the literary disease that found its natural expression in what Gautier called the necessary and fatal idiom of peoples and civilizations, whose natural life has been replaced by an artificial one. 76. With its emphasis on post-positive constructions or on domesticate layers of meaning or descriptions verbal and repoussé, of the sort with which Wilde amuses himself in the idiosyncratic chapter 11 of Dorian Gray, the decadent style remakes the body of its maker, whose elegant deportment, vivacity of countenance and prestige of reputation obscure the pronounced powers of cerebration that render him a solitary, a nerve sufferer, and almost a madman. Lombroso 6. 232. To Lombroso, even the love of heavily ornamented forms so characteristic of the decadent style seemed a symptom of insanity, for he had noted that monomaniacs showed a singular predilection for arabesques and ornaments which tend to assume a purely geometric form, without loss of elegance. 200. It was no accident, he therefore thought, that Edgar Allan Poe, the tutelary deity of the French decadence, had called his collection of stories Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, 1839. It seemed to Lombroso, that is, that in deliberately choosing a title that would exclude the human countenance, Poe had sought to create the impression that his compositions were extra-human. Although 19th century aestheticians understood the arabesque to have been born out of the Islamic injunction, by no means unambiguous, that seemed to forbid the representation of human beings, Lombroso pointed out that it nevertheless suggests a human figure, 318, so that metaphorically Poe was in fact shadowing forth the crucial fact that his emphasis on what he termed his matured purpose and very careful elaboration seemed intended to hide, which is to suggest, as Baudelaire did, that the man is found in his work. The characters and incidents are the framework and drapery of his memories. 77. In the same fashion, the complexities of the decadent style in essence serve as a surrogate for or signifier of the very decompositive elements that superficially at least they would seem to deny or occlude. As Ray Beth Gordon notes in her study of ornament, fantasy, and desire in 19th century French literature, one of the primary functions of ornament is to carry meaning and intent that have been suppressed or excluded from the central field, with the ornamental itself serving as the site of the emergence of desire repressed elsewhere. In the texts of fin de siècle writing that it invades. 78. It seems probable that members of this stigmatized group derived a good deal of ironic satisfaction from the knowledge that the motivation underlying their challenge to bourgeois respectability would be so grossly misconstrued by the self-anointed experts who thought of themselves as possessing the requisite experience. And yet, to read what the decadents had to say for themselves is to be struck by the similarities in approach and attitude between the excoriator and the excoriated, leading one to conclude, as Barbara Spackman does in her study of the fin de siècle rhetoric of sickness, that Nordau is perhaps not so stupid as he might seem. 79. Those who attacked decadence and those who gathered under its banner, after all, praised their respective descriptions of the decadent style in roughly the same terms. Although many of those who called themselves decadent defined the term in very different ways, decadent literature in general was understood by both sides as a celebration of and an evocation of the variety of beauty bred of disease, what Baudelaire called la phosphorescence de l'operature, the phosphorescence of decay, and the American poet Francis Altus, brother of the novelist Edgar, in his turn described in an answer, 1873, as the bluish touch flush with the beauty from horrors brought forth 80 decadent texts. Are further characterized by a so-called morbid attention to form and a predilection for a perversity that arises out of the conjunction of ingenious, complicated, and jeweled language and the repulsive and sometimes morally repugnant ideas conveyed by that language. In his preface to Les Fleurs du Mal, 1857, for example, Gautier defined a new style. He resisted the standard nomenclature as one that strives to take colors from all palettes, notes from all keyboards in order to convey in new forms and words that have not yet been heard the distinctly pathological monstrosities of the coming age, the subtle confidences of neuropsyche, the confessions of aging lust turning into depravity, and the odd hallucinations of fixed ideas passing into madness. 81 Nordau is really paraphrasing Gautier when he provides his exposition of the decadent language, which is itself, he claims, an extension of a mystically degenerate mind, with its shifting nebulous ideas, its fleeting formless shadowy thought, its perversions and aberrations, its tribulations and impulsions. To express this state of mind, a new and unheard of language must in fact be found, since there cannot be in any customary language designations corresponding to presentations which in reality do not exist. 300. Incriminating as he intends to be, Nordau probably comes closer to an understanding of the true motivation behind the decadent's devotion to form and technique than T.S. Eliot did when, writing about Baudelaire, he observed that the care for perfection of form, among some of the romantic poets of the 19th century, was an effort to support, or to conceal from view, an inner disorder. 82 As Simons announced in his study of the decadent movement, healthy we cannot call it, and healthy it does not wish to be considered. 83 Acutely conscious of language, the decadent infects his creation with his neurosis not by describing his emotional state but by succumbing to or indulging in what was satirized as an attack of nerves on paper. 84. The decadent story, poem, or text, then, conveys beauty, disease, or tension not in any traditional sense strictly by means of characterization or plot, for example, but rather in the contours, shadows, and rhythms created by a language that exposes the reader to a hidden melody, what René A. Kincaid has called language in its high neurotic mode. 85 Nordau referred to the typically decadent text as psychophysiologically accurate, a commonplace expression, he claimed, by the time he invoked it, in the sense that within it are encoded the psychological and physiological characteristics of its maker. 324. By permitting the stylized expression of intense emotions, and by channeling nervous energy into syntactic patternings, the text makes possible the self-deliverance of the artist. Nordau 324, in much the same way that a patch of linen, embroidered with colored threads pulled from her clothing, was worked with the faithful representations of the delusions of a woman living in isolation whose case Lamrasso recounted. Her autobiography is, so to speak, traced in this embroidery. In every piece of work she has represented herself. 184. In the picture of Dorian Gray, Basil Hallward contends that his is an age in which men treat art as if it were meant to be a form of autobiography, a notion that Wilde adapts in the preface to the work when he writes that the highest as the lowest form of criticism is a mode of autobiography. Wilde 57, 48. One arrives at meaning in isolated works of fin de siècle literature, in other words, by reading the deliberately encoded signs and stigmata, as well as accompanying themes and ideas, just as Lamrasso searched for physical traits, and Nordau for psychological ones, in order to read the represented body and, by extension, to discern the real nature of the human and the individual self. Decadence, both cultural and stylistic, emerges in many works of fin de siècle horror that explore the dynamic between external forms and internal, psychological, metaphysical, structural, disorders. Like the Gothic romance itself, which Maurice Levy described as an imaginative compensation, an expression of the anguish engendered by the historical context, these later stories attempt to discover the sources of the psychological fears and sense of cultural anxiety that impelled their writers to experiment with this underground genre. 86 Many late 19th century stories of horror and the supernatural are decadent in the sense that their defining themes and leitmotifs are drawn from popular reinterpretations of scientific theories that serve to undermine the faith of so many eminent Victorians in the inherent stability and continued advancement of human society theories, for example, like that informing the new biology, which came to seem as deceptive, in its own way, as the elusive processes it had disclosed. It thus lay open to the charge that it had not done what it had seemed to promise in Darwin's grandfather's day, for example, that it would do. Huxley made it his business to emphasize that evolution, a term that Victorians tended to think of as synonymous with progress and advancement, the staunchly optimistic attitude underlying Ramsay MacDonald's pre-war credo in praise of humanity's movement up and up and up, and on and on and on, a more tempered if equally progressive version of which is to be found in Tennyson's oft-recalled aphorism that men may rise on stepping stones / of their dead selves to higher things, was not inevitable or perpetual, in that devolution in the sense of degeneration, retrogression, and decay was also possible. Every cosmic magma predestined to evolve into a new world, Huxley urged, has been the no less predestined end of a vanquished predecessor. 87 By the latter part of the century, dissolution seemed so integral a part of the natural cycle, so fully ingrained in what Huxley termed the cosmic forces, whose ends are not man's ends, as to prompt the realization that evolution and its morbid opposite were really two phases of the same process. It could then be argued that in devolution the traditional signposts of advancement, heightened beauty, or increased complexity of form might in fact signify imminent reversion. 88 The theory of evolution encourages no nihil anticipations. Huxley gruesomely reminded readers of his Evolution and Ethics. If, for millions of years, our globe has taken the upward road, yet, sometime, the summit will be reached and the downward route will be commenced. The most daring imagination will hardly venture upon the suggestion that the power and the intelligence of man can ever arrest the precession of the great year. 89 Huxley's vision of the future of the universe, which echoed Darwin's version of the shape of the past, was absorbed into the late 19th century stories that take as their subject the disclosure of corruption and that consequently present an image of a world populated with beings who might have looked like Wells's Aloy but who thought and behaved as his Morlocks did. H.P. Lovecraft's later assertion that the most terrible conception of the human brain is the possibility of a malign and particular suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature which are our only safeguard against the assaults of chaos and the demons of unplumbed space is merely a recapitulation of the anxiety felt by his Victorian precursors, whose worldview, in the face of assaults by the new sciences present in embryonic or even explicit form in the writings of Darwin, as in those of his mentor, Lyell, or of his contemporary Lord Kelvin, gradually lost its coherence. 90 The self-same anxiety nourished William Hope Hodgson's massive, fascinating, almost unreadable, and Wells indebted The Nightland, 1912. A horror fantasy set in a distant twilight future, after the sun had lost all power to light, a time when the world had grown very dreadful, full of lawlessness and degeneracy, when unmeasurable outward powers had allowed to pass the barrier of life some of those monsters and of human creatures so wondrously cushioned from us at this normal present, and when the remaining sound millions had banded together in a foredoomed attempt to protect themselves against the forces of darkness plotting the end of man by retreating to the great redoubt, a pyramid circuit by a vast electric circle powered by the fast-fading earth current. 91 The Nightland, and works like it, are fueled by the fear that traditional systems of belief once considered fixed and stable were in fact subject to the same forces of decay that had undermined the faith in the innate biological superiority of humanity and in the finely balanced, and divinely sanctioned, workings of a Newtonian universe. In one of his lectures on Darwin's philosophy of language, Muller offered one expression of this fear when he identified his own historical moment as the eve of a storm which will shake the oldest convictions of the world, and upset everything that is not firmly rooted. Just as Darwin's examination of an ostensibly peaceful landscape left him with a sense of intense anxiety, so Muller found himself in a universe in which imminent dissolution seemed to threaten protective boundaries and chaos seemed to underlie surface stability. There is everywhere the same desire to explain the universe, such as we know it, without the admission of any plan, any object, any superintendence, a desire to remove all specific barriers, not only those which separate man from the animal, and the animal from the plant, but those also which separate organic from inorganic bodies. Lastly, a desire to explain life as a mode of chemical action, and thought as a movement of nervous molecules. 92. The much feared suspension of the fixed laws of nature was reflected in a corresponding suspension of the fixed laws of narrative structure, linguistic and semantic stability, and authorial credibility in decadent horror stories situated within the larger context of late Gothic. The germ of this attitude lurked in the Gothic and romantic fantasies of authors such as Walpole and Hoffmann, but these decadent horror stories may be distinguished from their early Gothic precursors in the sense that their creators, adopting Poe's dictum that true terror is not of Germany, but of the soul, developed a self-consciously decadent style that, in its pursuit of irregularly beautiful forms, verbal ornatus, and miasmic atmospheres, proved to be the medium best capable of embodying the symptoms of internal madness and degeneration what a gloating Gautier had envisioned as the larvae of superstitions, the haggard phantoms of insomnia, nocturnal terrors, obscure fantasies at which the daylight would stand amazed, and all that the soul conceals of the dark, the twisted, and the vaguely horrible, at the bottom of its deepest and furthest recesses. 93 Such a style generates in the reader a frisson nouveau, the term Hugo gave to the emotion he sought to evoke in his plot asks the instinctive, visceral shudder provoked by the presence of something monstrous or uncanny expressed in the very lines and proportions of a text or an image. Those experimenting with decadence and horror learn to create what Lovecraft, an admirer and on occasion an imitator of fin de siècle horror writers such as Matthew Phipps Shield, Arthur Machen, and Wilde, described as the actual anatomy of the terrible or the physiology of fear. The physiology of fear was constructed, he wrote, out of the exact sort of lines and proportions that connect up with the latent instincts or hereditary memories of fright, and the proper color contrasts and lighting effects to stir the dormant sense of strangeness. 94 We might think of Lovecraft's analysis as a macabre version of William Hogarth's theory of the line of beauty, which, though drawn on the surfaces only of solid world bodies yet conveys as accurate an idea as is possible, of the inside of those surfaces a definition remade yet again in the Neoplatonism of Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, in which, we are told, the mere shapes and patterns of things become refined, and gain a kind of symbolical value, as though they were themselves patterns of some other and more perfect form whose shadow they make real. 75.95 Once again, however, 19th century scientific investigation provides a more provocative analog to Lovecraft's allusion to latent instincts and hereditary memories of fright, for Darwin, although he did not define it in these terms, had also invoked a kind of physiology of fear in his expression of the emotions of man and animal, in which he fixed on fear as the emotion that promised to deliver the richest source of evidence concerning the instinctive, as opposed to the conscious and reasoned, origins of expression. Unlike other feelings that would evince only a diffusive action too general to throw much light on special expressions, fear, when strong, here Darwin quotes from Herbert Spencer's Principles of Psychology 1855, expresses itself in a general tension of the muscular system, which in turn represents the weaker forms of the actions that accompany the killing of prey. Anyone viewing such a display tends, Darwin suggests, to react instinctively. Indeed, only a few such facial cues are required to prompt the observer's full-blown response to the immediately recognizable evocation of horror and pain, for from the power of the imagination and of sympathy we put ourselves in the position of the sufferer, and feel something akin to fear. 96 In other words, certain envisaged lines, features, and patterns lend themselves to such decipherment. Moreover, Darwin notes that the face itself is prepared, physiologically, to evince horror, equipped as it is with what Duchenne de Boulogne, a pioneer in the study of electrophysiology, the forerunner of neurology, called the muscle of fright, of terror, which, he claimed, when tonically contracted by fear, evokes that very emotion, and in so doing gives rise to the expression of the damned. Figure 13.97 Darwin saw underlying physiological structures and systems, then, as providing for the bodily transcription of fear. In this sense the human body, and not just the body of the born criminal, is precisely analogous to certain literary texts, the underlying structures of which, syntactic, narrative, structural, script of fear that elicits a visceral shudder and brings to the surface the reader's own sublimated impulses and instinctual memories. In the pursuit of a revised decadence, the creators of fin de siècle horror became anatomists of the imagination, producing horror stories that served as apt metaphors not merely for the society that produced them but for the concept of horror itself, which was represented far more realistically than even Darwin, whose research had helped to develop models for the scripting of the body, both literally and textually, could have imagined. For all his emphasis on the need to read plainly anatomized fear, and for all his denigration of painters for their reliance upon accessories which tell the tale of the starker emotions, Darwin himself romanticized certain sorts of fear, availing himself of stock expressions and traditional rhetorical strategies. See what a change, he wrote, is effected in the face of a woman whose child is threatened, how she starts up with threatening aspect, how her eyes sparkle and her face reddens, how her bosom heaves, nostrils dilate, and heart beats, for anger, and not maternal love, has habitually led to action. 98 This sort of inflated, formulaic rhetoric, once functional because psychophysiologically accurate in its own right and thus capable of creating a vivid picture in the mind's eye, was rejected by the creators of the decadent horror story in favor of stylized descriptions of horror. Highly polished and carefully wrought, the surface beauty and seductive charm of their fearful conceit served to veil the corrupting and corrosive anxieties, truths, and even abysses that lurk beneath. One took a chance, of course, in exposing oneself to such literature. In his analytical on some technical elements of style in literature, Robert Louis Stevenson demystified beauty, fitness, and significance as hollow virtues lying wholly on the surface of our arts and occupations, suggesting that to pry below is to be appalled by their emptiness and shocked by the coarseness of the strings and pulleys. Speaking less prosaically than Stevenson of the gross materialities underlying the aesthetics of creation, Wilde contented himself with a cryptic warning in his preface to the picture of Dorian Gray, which explores the intimate connection between surface beauty and inner corruption. Those who go beneath the surface of art do so at their peril. 3.99 In the sense decadent horror writers saw themselves not as fantasists but as true realists who depicted not the crude verities of a Thackeray or an Eliot. The sweepings of a Pentonville omnibus were all that Wilde could discern in the latter's novels, but rather what Pater had sought to capture in a style that could deliver that finest and most intimate form of truth, the vrai verite. 100 Pater described the distinctive style of his period as the special and privileged artistic faculty of the present day, an instrument of many stops. Meditative, observant, descriptive, eloquent, analytic, plaintive, fervid. 101 In its ability to permit a glimpse of transcendent realms of meaning, to permit the disclosure, in fact, of subterranean horrors, the decadent style functioned as another of those delicate instruments that Pater admired Leonardo da Vinci for having created the beautiful women in his paintings who, in confronting viewers with otherwise occulted realities, made them aware of the subtler forces of nature, and the modes of their action, all that is magnetic in it, all those finer conditions wherein material things rise to that subtlety of operation which constitutes them spiritual, where only the finer nerve and the keener touch can follow. It is as if in certain significant examples we actually saw those forces at their work on human flesh. Nervous, electric, faint, always with some inexplicable faintness, these people seem to be subject to exceptional conditions, to feel powers at work in the common air unfelt by others, to become, as it were, the receptacle of them, and pass them on to us in a chain of secret influences. 102. And just as it was the linguistic equivalent of these delicate instruments that had introduced powers and secret influences into the realm of the living, so the decadent style was also the author's equivalent of the microscope, an instrument that by mid-century had fully exposed the otherwise hidden realms of the microbe and the bacterium, and had thus made possible the disclosure of what Huysmans called la souveraine horror. 103. Oscar Wilde's Basil Hallward is a searcher after verities. He affiliates himself with realism rather than with aestheticism, who plumbs horrific depths, at least in his portrait of Dorian Gray, which he calls the best work of his life. Hallward has learned to recreate life in a way that was hidden from him before. 56. For his idealized subject's presence is felt, in that particular canvas and even more pervasively in others in which he does not figure at all, in the curves of certain lines, in the loveliness and subtleties of certain colors. That is all. 56.104 Hallward's masterpiece is one of the two poisonous texts in the picture of Dorian Gray, both of them exercising a fatal influence over those who come into contact with them. The portrait is also one of a long line of similarly poisonous texts, beginning with the sorcerer's books of the medieval period and including such fictional 19th and 20th century incarnations as Merlin's Book of Magic, with, as Tennyson imagined it, every page having an ample marge, / and every margin closing in the midst / a square of text that looks a little blot, / the text no larger than the limbs of fleas, / and every square of text an awful charm. Chambers' aforementioned The King in Yellow, Lovecraft's Necronomicon, the purulent wallpaper of Charlotte Perkins Gilman's fevered fiction, the written statement of Henry James's Governess, its quaint antiquarianism, conveyed by old, faded ink, and beautiful hand, challenged by the term outbreak. That describes the anticipated effect of its release from a locked drawer in which it has been quarantined for years, the full statement of Henry Jekyll, which cannot be disclosed until after the sealed narrative of Hasty Lanyon has been read, and only then by J.G. Utterson, for whose hands alone it is intended and in case of whose predecease it is to be destroyed unread, and Keats's deceptively alluring essay written on behalf of the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs in Conrad's Heart of Darkness. 105 The line extends, as well, to such real-life examples as Huysmans's Ouroboros, 1884, which served as the fatally influential urtext for many of the most jaundiced books of the 90s, and Pater's Conclusion, which George Eliot decried as quite poisonous and in which John Wordsworth, grandnephew of the poet, discerned dangers that he reproved Pater for having made accessible to minds weaker than your own. 1061 might even include in this context the letters for which Huysmans and Pater, as some of Wilde's supporters darkly hinted, had been indirectly responsible, those, that is, that Lieutenant Colonel Henry Isaacson, the governor and mulberry-faced dictator, according to Wilde, of Reading Prison, gave his notorious ward special permission to compose in the latter days of his incarceration. Regarded as potentially contaminatory, Wilde's letters could not be circulated even among his friends until, as Richard Ellman reminds us, they had been collected and inspected, and the writing materials removed, a perception of their dangerous nature apparently shared even by his supporters, to judge by the amount of powderization that was deemed necessary before Wilde's epic letter, De Profundis, could see the light. Robbie Ross, Wilde's editor in this case, going so far as to change the title from its original Incarcerate et Vincules. 107 The narrator of Chambers' The Yellow Sign, 1895, gives us an insight into what happens when one encounters one of these contagious texts, in this case the play The King in Yellow with its poisonous, mottled, yellow, serpent skin binding. Oh, the sin of writing such words which are clear as crystal, limpid and musical as bubbling springs, words which sparkle and glow like the poisoned diamonds of the Medicis. Oh, the wickedness, the hopeless damnation of a soul who could fascinate and paralyze human creatures with such words understood by the ignorant and wise alike, words which are more precious than jewels, more soothing than heavenly music, more awful than death itself. 108 Critical attention has tended to focus on what is actually the lesser of the two occult texts that figure in Wilde's story, the infamous Yellow Book with which Lord Wotton continues his protracted seduction of Dorian. In a scene recalling that in which the seven deadly sins pass ethereally before Marlowe's Faustus, Dorian, himself a decadent Faustus, becomes absorbed in the strangest of books, with its exquisite rhyment, its delicate sound of flutes, and the sins of the world that pass in dumb show before him, making real to him things of which he had only dimly or never dreamed. 109. Traditionally thought of as the font and inspiration of Dorian's excesses, this unnamed book, with its mere cadence of sentences and its music of complex refrains and movements elaborately repeated, 141, infects Dorian with the thought that evil exists simply as a mode through which he could realize his conception of the beautiful. 157. Yet Dorian insists that all his misery originates in the fatal portrait, 166, itself, and not in his exposure to a breviary detailing the requisite sins and obsessions of the cultivated sensualist, although it is true enough that at various points in his story this multiform creature blames his undoing on Basil, book, and portrait. With its curious jeweled style, its elaborate paraphrases, and its monstrous metaphors, the story's poisonous book provides Dorian with a role model in its account of a certain young Parisian, 141, whose behavior subverts bourgeois standards of conduct. By Lord Henry's reckoning, such a book possesses the only sort of immorality that can inhere in a work of art, since it exerts a pernicious influence on the reader. He does not think his natural thoughts, or burn with his natural passions. His virtues are not real to him. His sins, if there are such things as sins, are borrowed. He becomes an echo of someone else's music, an actor of a part that has not been written for him. 61. Conversely, the portrait merely hints at what Dorian himself is capable of doing by alluding in its very lines and contours to the apparently monstrous but otherwise only obliquely referred to acts that he has already committed. William E. Butler would have it that the Yellow Book performs a commensurate function because it provides Dorian with instruction in advanced ways of attaining what he is already determined to seek. Having produced in the mind of the latter malady of dreaming, 141, it merely catapults him, Butler suggests, into the life of hedonism and iniquity that he is in any event poised to undertake. 109. Although book and portrait draw roughly the same response from Dorian, each simultaneously repulses and fascinates him. The book contains the story of his own life, written before he had lived it. 142. The story that the portrait lives, however, cannot develop further before Dorian himself advances further in his process of self-development. 61. The book is thus a prefiguring type of himself. 142. Whereas the portrait is a diary of his life from day to day. 162. Which cannot narrate the story it records before Dorian himself furthers the plot. 110. It is therefore more truly one of those works of art that, as Wilde suggests both in the preface and elsewhere in his narrative, mirrors the spectator, and not life. 48. And thus Basil conflates the two, simulacrum and original, when he announces early on that as soon as you are dry, you shall be varnished, and framed, and sent home. Then you can do what you like with yourself. 69.111. Unlike a more conventional author who shapes his plot to fit his thematic ends, Dorian sits mesmerized before his canvas, reading a story that he can neither predict nor premeditate, trapped as he is in his deterministic tragedy, in which even an act of premeditation would translate into but another predetermined act, the ultimate consequences of which only the portrait, a text that envisages no outcome, no closure, can reveal. We see how fully Dorian is imprisoned in his own fictive world. His fatal text, we learn, never leaves the room in which it is written. 134. When he attempts to touch up the portrait by sparing the virtue of Hetty Merton, the country girl whom he would otherwise have seduced, he does, of course, reshape the portrait, but not as he had planned. Being resolved upon a life of infinite passion, pleasure subtle and secret, wild joys and wilder sins, Dorian is pained initially to consider the desecration that was in store for the fair face on the canvas. 126. His regret, however, is transformed into a curious pleasure as he anticipates the growing fascination that the painted image and ever-decomposing object of contemplation will hold for him. Even his utter inability to comprehend the subtle means by which the canvas physically enacts its morbid metamorphosis provides him with a peculiar frisson. Was there some subtle affinity between the chemical atoms that shaped themselves into form and color on the canvas, and the soul that was within him? Could it be that what that soul thought, they realized, that what it dreamed, they made true? Or was there some other, more terrible reason? He shuddered, and felt afraid, and, going back to the couch, lay there, gazing at the picture in sickened horror. 118-19. Once again, Lord Henry, with his typically Mephistophelian prescience, captures the quintessence of Dorian's experience. When he speculates that a certain kind of tragedy transforms the actors into the spectators of the play, we watch ourselves, and the mere wonder of the spectacle enthralls us. 123. As a reader of his own story, Dorian is as scrupulous as he is avid. He abruptly quits both house and guests in Nottinghamshire to escape to his boyhood playroom, which is also the room in which the final scene of his own somber tragedy will play itself out, and as he reads he grows more and more enamored of his own beauty, more and more interested in the corruption of his soul. 143. Although thrilled by the very sharpness of the contrast, he yearns for that which is always denied him, the opportunity to witness the slipping of the mask. Spurred by the hope that someday he would see the change taking place before his very eyes. 126. He examines the portrait with minute care, and sometimes with a monstrous hand. Terrible delight, searching for the signs of sin or the signs of age. 143.112. The signs of age for which Dorian searches so avidly are the signs of his own encroaching decrepitude, although we have just learned that his friends and acquaintances wondered how one so charming and graceful as he was could have escaped the stain of an age that was at once sordid and sensual. 142. So far from escaping such staining, however, Dorian gradually becomes the visible emblem of his fin de siècle, fin du globe age, serving as well as an ironic embodiment of Basil's vision of him as the visible incarnation of an unseen ideal. 132. And as the novel progresses, he becomes the quintessential hypocrite, a whited sepulchre, a perverse avatar of the Bride of Christ, who must wear purple and jewels and fine linen that she may hide the pallid macerated body that is worn by the suffering that she seeks for, and wounded by self-inflicted pain. 151. He is the complex multiform creature whose very flesh was tainted with the monstrous maladies of the dead. 154. And his charming boyish smile. 153. Elides, and, as a perfect counterfeit, serves to reveal the face of his soul. 164. Which has been eaten away by leprosies of sin so virulent that the rotting of a corpse in a watery grave was not so fearful. 164. He is also related to the youthful Satan who appears in X.L's Aut Diabolus Aut Nihil. 1888. Another period work with which the picture of Dorian Gray seems to share a good deal in common. S.A. Majest, as he is called by his devotees, the group of 12 men of culture and refinement, is apparently 20, tall, as beardless as the young Augustus, with bright golden hair falling from his forehead like a girl's. When he makes his appearance in evening dress, his cheeks are flushed as if with wine or pleasure, and his eyes gleam with a look of inexpressible sadness, of intense despair, and we might recall here the look of infinite pity reflected in Dorian's eyes as he blackmails his former friend and cohort, Alan Campbell, into changing Basil and everything that belongs to him into a handful of ashes to be scattered in the air. 172-73.113. Dorian is the boyish variant of the well-heeled devil whom Rops, in the Sphinx, 1879, figure 14, depicts as eavesdropping upon the fevered outpourings of a woman who presses herself upon the stony Sphinx whom she supplicates, just as Dorian fantasizes about secreting himself in a confessional and listening to men and women whispering through the worn grating the true story of their lives. 146. In his Instrumentum Diaboli, his commentary on the Sphinx and Rops's other Sataniques, Huysmans makes explicit the manner in which the Spin de Siècle fiend is representative of the conceits not merely of Dorian or Rops but also of the age itself. In its position as frontispiece, the Sphinx served as the gateway to J. Barbie or Evilly's collection of diabolical tragedies, the true stories of this age of progress, as their author calls them. Titled Les Diaboliques 1886.114. Whereas the Satan of old took horrible and grotesque shapes, Rops's Satan is thoroughly modern, up to date in every way. Satan in a black dress suit, the modern, the real 20th century polished Satan, a gentleman in evening dress, quiet and polite, patient and persistent. 115. And as the portrait is a visible symbol of Dorian's degradation of sin, 119, as Dorian becomes what Lord Henry speculates he might be, the visible symbol of their century, 65, so the portrait is by extension the visible symbol of what the cynical Dorian characterizes as the native land of the hypocrite, 160. Dorian's picture is far more enthralling, and therefore far more poisonous, than the stories, ultimately tame, Yellow Book could ever aspire to be, because it functions as an idiosyncratic revelation of aging lust turning into depravity, embodying the unique stigmata of its own spiritual degeneracy and providing Dorian, by extension, with his most compelling excuse for announcing to the incredulous Duchess of Monmouth that art is a malady, 193. The focus is on his face, the wonderful beauty of which Lord Henry earlier described as a form of genius higher, indeed, than genius, 64. Yet there is also another whose secret the portrait betrays, one who knows better than anyone else that it is not only the sitter merely the accident who is revealed on the canvas, but the painter another spectator who, on the colored canvas, reveals himself, 52. The portrait is psychophysiologically accurate in the sense that it embodies its maker's genius even more certainly than it does Dorian's. Basil has managed to do what Lord Henry covertly longs to do, to project one's soul into some gracious form, and let it tarry there for a moment, 74 to 75, and thus he initially refuses to exhibit the picture at the Grosvenor, or anywhere else for that matter, claiming that there is too much of himself in the thing. Basil is as secretive as Dorian because he is as convinced as his idealized subject comes to be that the fearful image is inscripted with the very secret of its own soul, 52, which he will not bear to the shallow, prying eyes of the world, 56. Once separated from his creation, however, the painter is able to shake off the intolerable fascination of its presence, and, having forcibly rid himself of the belief that every flake and film of color seemed to him to reveal his secret, 133, he permits himself to entertain the notion of exhibiting the portrait in Paris. For Dorian, however, who remains to the end held enthralled by this auto-icon, the prospect that the world was going to be shown his secret and that people might be permitted to gape at the mystery of his life, 131, is insupportable. Once beyond the pale of the portrait's provocative sphere of influence, Basil loses some part of the visionary aptitude that has allowed him to discern Dorian's presence most palpably when no image of him is there, 56. He persuades himself that the truths the portrait reveals are less searing than they really are, and in convincing himself that art conceals the artist far more completely than it ever reveals him, and that form and color tell us of form and color, that is all, 133, Basil becomes a resistant reader, for the latter hypothesis in particular proves a palette substitute for his earlier admission that Dorian is insinuated in the curves of certain lines, in the loveliness and subtleties of certain colors. That is all, 13. Although he is a capable physiognomist, he admits to having spurned a would-be sitter because there was something in the shape of his fingers that he hated, 130, he loses the ability to read Dorian aright, refusing to believe anything against a boy with such a pure, bright, innocent face and marvelous untroubled youth, 159. Taking refuge in Lombrosian hermeneutics, Basil insists that if a wretched man has a vice, it shows itself in the lines of his mouth, the droop of his eyelids, the molding of his hands even, 159. Yet he is not so resistant a reader as to blind himself to the truth, and when brought into the portrait's subversive presence, Basil readily falls victim to his old morbid fascination, recognizing the brushwork but not the subject of his canvas. He deduces that the surface could only be quite undisturbed, and as he had left it because it was from within, apparently, that the foulness and horror had come. Through some strange quickening of inner life, the leprosies of sin were slowly eating the thing away, 164. The portrait bears ironic witness to his belief that sin is a thing that writes itself across a man's face. It cannot be concealed, 159, ironic because Dorian discovers in the end that his beauty, all ivory and rose leaves, had been to him but a mask, 212, and more ironic still because Wilde had elsewhere noted that a mask tells us more than a face. 116 Basil suffers an emblematic death at the hands of his own creation. His naive conception of narrow correspondences and physical equivalencies ruptured, violently replaced by one predicated on contrarieties, contradictions, and inversions moments before the embodied self rises up to kill him, thus confirming Dorian's suspicion that there is something fatal about a portrait. It has a life of its own, 135. In its guise as a literary work of art, the picture of Dorian Gray also assumes something of a life of its own, and one as destructive in its own way to its maker as Basil's portrait proves to be. That it would eventually be hauled up before, interrogated, and even tortured to elicit the desired confession by those seeking information concerning the life and convictions of its creator, who was thus forced to defend himself against the charge of having produced a beautifully scripted confession of his own criminal intent, should not perhaps have come as a surprise to Wilde, who had admitted that his sui generis creation contains much of me in it, an opinion that Lord Alfred Douglas's mother, Lady Queensberry, apparently shared, as her distressed complaint to her son suggests. If Mr. Wilde has acted as I am convinced he has the part of a Lord Henry Wotton to you, I could never feel differently towards him than I do, as the murderer of your soul. 117 James Joyce also suspected as much when he credited, or charged, Wilde with having had some good intentions in writing it, some wish to put himself before the world, although Wilde had never masked the criminality of his artistic and theoretical explorations, as his intentions, 1891, had made flamboyantly clear. 118 Since neither the Criminal Investigation Department nor the Treasury nor the Vigilance Society chose to prosecute it, or him, as one would any common criminal, Dorian Gray was brought before the jury in Wilde's infamous first trial of 1895 as a sort of witness for the prosecution. Although Justice Sir Arthur Charles, the judge in the case, dismissed the notion that an author could be confounded with the characters of the persons he creates, Lord Queensberry's counsel, Edward Carson, devoted an extensive part of his cross-examination during the first trial to reading Wilde's story in order to reveal what the jury could not have determined simply by viewing or conversing with a man charged with authoring what the editor of the Daily Chronicle had reviled as a poisonous book, the atmosphere of which is heavy with the mephitic odors of moral and spiritual putrefaction, leaving Behind a contaminating trail 119 having learned in the crucible of his experience that society never forgives the dreamer, Wilde sought to discover whether it might indeed be the case that it often forgives the criminal, as he had once believed. Point 120 in the end, desperate to escape his confinement, Wilde, betraying his own earlier self, proclaimed himself a criminal, but with none of the winning effrontery accompanying his earlier pronouncements that lying and poetry are arts requiring the most disinterested devotion, that pen, pencil, and poison are not antithetical on moral or aesthetic grounds. We might recall here Nordau's correlation of pen, pencil, and bomb, that all the arts are immoral, that an intense personality is created out of sin, and that crime, because it seems under certain conditions to have created individualism, and art, because it is the most intense mode of individualism, together render the artist criminal by nature as well as by art. Point 121 addressing himself to the Home Secretary, Sir Matthew White Ridley, Wilde humbly urged that he sought not to palliate in any way the terrible offences of which he was rightly found guilty, but to point out that such offences are forms of sexual madness and are recognized as such not merely by modern pathological science but by much modern legislation, notably in France, Austria, and Italy, where the laws affecting these misdemeanors have been repealed, on the ground that they are diseases to be cured by a physician, rather than crimes to be punished by a judge. In the works of eminent men of science such as Rousseau and Nordau, this is especially insisted on with reference to the intimate connection between madness and the literary and artistic temperament. Professor Nordau in his book on degenerescence published in 1894 having devoted an entire chapter to the petitioner as a specially typical example of this fatal law. The petitioner is now keenly conscious of the fact that while the 3 years preceding his arrest were from the intellectual point of view the most brilliant years of his life, still that during the entire time he was suffering from the most horrible form of erotomania, which made him forget his wife and children, his high social position in London and Paris, his European distinction as an artist, the honor of his name and family, his very humanity itself, and left him the helpless prey of the most revolting passions, and of a gang of people who for their own profit ministered to them, and then drove him to his hideous ruin. It is under the ceaseless apprehension lest this insanity, that displayed itself in monstrous sexual perversion before, may now extend to the entire nature and intellect, that the petitioner writes this appeal which he earnestly entreats may be at once considered. Horrible as all actual madness is, the terror of madness is no less appalling, and no less ruinous. To the soul. Point 122. Part of what makes this letter a horror story in its own right is the knowledge, accessible to all but a wretchedly broken man, that Nordau had not earned his place beside Napoleon, Nero, and Narcissus, in Oliver Herford's An Alphabet of Celebrities, 1899, by being less notorious than Wilde himself had been by making his theories of art and criminality, that is, less accessible than Wilde's had been to people like Carson, who found in them both a motivation for purging society of it poisonous presence that Wilde's was perceived to be. Body the critic Sidney Colvin's characterization of Oscar Wildeism as the most pestilent and hateful disease of our time, and a means of doing so. Point 123 Wilde's petition to be released from prison was denied, but he was granted writing materials and greater access to books, although the texts he produced while incarcerated, as we have had occasion to note, were as jealously guarded as was their creator himself, exposure to either clearly regarded as equally threatening to the health and well-being of society as a prosecutable criminal and a witness for the prosecution, as the secretion of a hidden life whose morbid secrets it betrays, as one of those self-asserting organisms, one anonymous reviewer's term for works like Dorian Gray, spawned from the leprous literature of the French decadence, another anonymous reviewer's description of the same. The picture of Dorian Gray is the animated air of an era in which, as Bruce Haley reminds us, health and disease were increasingly viewed as being transmittable states of an organism's character or spirit. In the creative process they are passed from the character of the age to that of the artist and thence to the character of the work, and finally, as the work finds its audience, back into the character of the age. 124 as a Lombrosian phrenopathic monument, fully invested with and reciprocally corruptive of the life of its day, it served as a literary counterpart to those more conventional monuments that, as Ruskin had argued, may be taken as the architectural expression of national life and character, because on these inner and great questions depend all the outer and little ones, with certain right states of temper and moral feeling producing all good architecture, without exception, and all bad architecture indicative of concealed national infidelity and of domestic corruption. 125 Although Wilde, in defense of his work, maintained that the superior pleasure in literature is to realize the non-existent, that life by its realism is always spoiling the subject matter of art, Pater took note of the pleasant accessory detail, taken straight from the culture, the intellectual and social interests, the conventionalities, of the moment that invest the picture of Dorian Gray with the better sort of realism, throwing into relief the adroitly devised supernatural element. 126 The rage that it provoked, part of the contaminating trail that it left behind, was like the rage of Caliban. Frustrated by what they did see, enraged by what was occulted, readers found in these representations the image of what H.G. Wells would later describe as a mild and massive sphinx of British life, an amoeboid sphinx beneath the tranquil-looking surfaces of which many ferments were actively at work, while its serene and empty visage masked extensive processes of decay. 127. Wilde spoke perhaps more truly than he knew when, with thinly veiled self-delight, he confided to Beatrice May Alhison that the picture of Dorian Gray is rather like my own life, all conversation and no action, for the novel is rich in commentary upon the aesthetics of decadence and fin du globe tonalities, while it remains relatively free of the decadent gestures, stylistic and thematic, exhibited by other period texts with which it maintains a dialogue. 128 As others have remarked, it offers a decadent treatment of the traditional supernatural motif of the doppelganger arising as the spectral, subconscious other, already a familiar figure in such early supernatural fiction as Poe's William Wilson, 1839, and Remergent as the latent Darwinian type in later works such as Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, 1886. 129 It is also, however, much more concerned with materialism, physicality, and scientific determinism than a cursory reading might suggest. In it, Wilde examines many of the scientific laws with which Lord Henry suggests that it is useless to interfere, in a desperate search for some curious scientific reason to explain the portrait's chemical reconstitution of his guild. For example, Dorian reverses the terms of the argument of materialists such as Huxley, who sought a physical basis of life, wondering whether thought might not exercise an influence upon dead and inorganic things, Adam calling to Adam in secret love or strange affinity. 127. And then, changeable creature that he is, he goes on to assume a materialist stance, convinced that there was no mood of the mind that had not its counterpart in the sensuous life. 147. Arguing much more forcefully for its physical integrity, Lord Henry, on the other hand, insists that life is not governed by will or intention. Life is a question of nerves and fibers and slowly built up cells in which thought hides itself and passion has its dreams. 209. Scientific determinism is recast as genetic determinism when Dorian redacts a central premise of Morel's argument from degeneration to wit, that degeneracy is a condition transmissible, in ever more virulent forms, from the fathers to successive generations of sons when, wandering through his ancestral picture gallery, he considers the possibility that his very flesh was tainted with the monstrous maladies of the dead and dreams of strange legacies of thought and passion. 154. Degeneration blends into Darwinism when Dorian speculates that, since every fiber of the body, as every cell of the brain, seems to be instinct with fearful impulses, the passion for sin, 189, may be genetically encoded, and Darwinism in turn leads on to the materialistic doctrines of the Darwinism's movement in Germany, which delighted in the conception of the absolute dependence of the spirit on certain physical conditions, morbid or healthy, normal or diseased. 146. The theories of modern psychologists such as the medical psychiatrist Jean-Martin Charcot also enjoy some representation, as when Dorian intuits the myriad lives and myriad sensations of the sort of complex multiform creature, 124, occupying the pre-Freudian landscape that he surveys. Like the stories to which the next several chapters of this book are devoted, then, Dorian Gray mines scientific theory as it tropes the human body. Both as a text of outwardly pleasing aspect, in which ostensibly suppressed maladies and devolutionary promptings are scripted, and as the site of Gothic horrors. Despite its aphoristic tendencies, however, the novel possesses a well-defined skeletal structure and thus differentiates itself from other typical works in which horror and decadence express themselves through narrative atomization and fragmentation. Moreover, Wilde's use of jeweled language is much more restrained than such language later became in the fevered fictions of, for example, Sheil or John Buchan. Significantly, the most striking of the decorative passages in the novel tend to describe the artistic or intellectual works of others. Metaphors as monstrous as orchids characterize the stylistic excesses of the Yellow Book, about the pages of which clings the heavy odor of incense. 110. References to the stiff-flowered dalmatic, the jeweled lantern-shaped monstrance with that pallid wafer, and the fuming censers borne aloft by the grave boys, in their lace and scarlet. 146. Mark Dorian's ritualized engagement with aestheticism. Lord Henry's philosophy dances like a bacchante before those upon whom he bestows his extempore, if somewhat regetical, utterances. Her white feet trod the huge press at which wise Omar sits, till the seething grape juice rose round her bare limbs in waves of purple bubbles, or crawled in red foam over the vat's black, dripping, sloping sides. It was an extraordinary improvisation. 79. The improvisation is Wilde's as well, for the decorative idiom and ormolu of the day is less natural to him than to those other anatomists of decadence Baudelaire, Huysmans, or even the earlier Barbey d'Aurevilly in whose books we might expect to encounter such gorgeously gilt horrors, a fact not lost on Jorge Luis Borges, who argued that Wilde generally dispensed with the purple passages to which custom had linked his name. In verse or in prose, Wilde's syntax is always very simple. 130. The cultural decadence that provided these other excursions into horror with their subject overt or covered called for a correspondingly subtle textual and linguistic analog that only the decadent style, with its obsessive and sometimes monstrous metaphors, elaborate paraphrases, complex refrains, and exhaustive leptologia, could provide. 131. The decadent style of literature, Huysmans wrote, was attacked by organic diseases, weakened by intellectual senility, exhausted by syntactical excesses, sensitive only to the curious whims that excite the sick, but in it the outward form testified to the presence of the ravaging inward malady. 132. In those late 19th century works of literature and art that self-consciously employ such a style, it is simply expression, as Wilde's Lord Henry has it, that gives reality to things. 94. Words. Mere words. How terrible they were. How clear, and vivid, and cruel. One could not escape from them. And yet what a subtle magic there was in them. They seemed to be able to give a plastic form to formless things, and to have a music of their own as sweet as that of viol or of lute. Mere words. Was there anything so real as words? 62. Thus Dorian's thoughts shape themselves as he succumbs to his friend's influence, as Chambers' narrator succumbs to the power of the words of the King in Yellow, more precious than jewels, more soothing than heavenly music, more awful than death itself. Here, too, Dorian would seem to be paraphrasing Muller, who hypothesized that to examine the influence which words, mere words, have exercised on the minds of men would be to write a history of the world that would teach us more than any which we yet possess. 133. In the stories that are subjected to analysis in the remainder of this book, it is the word that is made flesh and the body of the text that betrays the secret sealed in the text of the body. Pater's description of one of the defining portraits of Leonardo's artistic corpus is perhaps worth recalling in a discussion that ch1's decadence, language, and horror. Speculating on the origins of the subtle charms of the Mona Lisa, Pater noted that her troubled beauty was directly related to her enigmatic spirit, wrought out from within upon the flesh, the deposit, little cell by little cell, of strange thoughts and fantastic reveries and exquisite passions. According to this anatomy, Leonardo's portrait serves as an analog to that of Dorian Gray, for the Mona Lisa's is a beauty into which the soul with all its maladies has passed. 134. In both texts, a subtle affinity exists between the soul of the subject and the soul of the plot, and in the fin de siècle stories that follow, the horror embodied in the soul of the plot is wrought out from within, little word by little word, in sentences and images that are symptomatic of the maladies of the soul.